Well, guys, before we jump in today to this brand new series that we're kicking off, what an incredible week with Camp 75, where so many of you guys, hundreds and hundreds of you guys, actually gave the most valuable resource you could possibly give, your time, to invest in thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals all around our community. It was an incredible, incredible week. In fact, if you've come to Northpoint, you know something we say here quite a bit is we say for far too long the church has been known for what we're against. We simply want to be known for what we're for, that we are for people, that we are for our community, that we are for the next generation. We're for this incredible city of Greater Austin. And as I think about Camp 75 the entire week, what a great example. What a demonstration of so many of you who partnered with what was taking place this whole week, that you are for the next generation and for our community. I mean, this last week, you partnered with almost 400 middle school and high school students who went out and served over 3,500 people. They made over 700 meals to give to the homeless and to the hungry, partnered with over 11 nonprofit organizations, Ronald McDonald Home, assisted living homes, food pantries. You know, one of my favorite was called Hope House. And if you're not familiar with Hope House, it's a home that has over 30 disabled children whose parents are no longer able to take care of them. And this week, the director of Hope House said to our team that over the last 2 years, not a single person outside the home has come to visit these children except you. And as I thought about that this week, I thought that's exactly what we did as a church this week. That you were able to leverage your God-given gifts to go serve, to go love as Christ loved you, and to be for the next generation, for people, and for our community. And I'm so incredibly proud. So I just want to give you guys a round of applause. What an amazing, amazing job. It's amazing. I'm so proud of our church. And if you're here today and you're, as a result of Camp 75, somebody invited you, I am so grateful you're here, and we are so excited to host you today. Well, as I said earlier, we are kicking off a brand new series today called Time Well Spent. And as I was thinking about this series and kind of where we're going and what we're going to be talking about, I couldn't help but just think about time. You know, time is an interesting thing, and time is absolutely everywhere. I was thinking this week, we have watches that tell the time, our phones, in our car, we know what time it is, on our devices, iPads, computers. If you walk into your place of employment, work, or school, you're looking at every room has a clock on the wall. If you go to a historic downtown, the courthouse has a big old clock. Historic churches, old school churches have the bells that remind you of time, And then if you're watching TV and it's just too difficult to raise your arm to look at your clock or your watch or your phone, you can just hit the remote and you're like, there's the time. I mean, time is everywhere. We are so aware of time. And throughout the day, at some point in time, you're probably going to ask or at least think about the question of what time is it? What time is it? In fact, as I'm talking today, you're probably going to wonder if I'm going to end on time. And in case you do, you need to know. There's a big old clock back there that I'm looking at. And the question is, am I going to pay attention to that clock or not? Who knows? We'll find out at the end. But my point is this, is that I'm just telling you, if you just think about time, we are so aware of time. Time is absolutely everywhere. And every now and then, there are things that happen in our life that we actually lose track of time. You're on that date with him or with her, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm mesmerized. Or you're listening to that podcast or reading that amazing book or watching that movie, and it's like time stands still. Or perhaps if you have kids, your kids are actually getting along. And for that just a few minutes, you're like, this is amazing. In fact, Jill and I, my beautiful wife and I, 2 weeks ago, we took a vacation for the 4th of July week to one of the most world famous beaches. You may have heard of it, called Port Aransas. We love that place. and so we're in Port A, and we're on a vacation with our 5 boys. And in fact, here's a picture of our boys right there. And Jill loves to get the old Navy t-shirts, the flag shirts, and does a picture every year. And so we're taking pictures, we're hanging out, and we had a moment. Like Jill and I are sitting there on the beach, and we're looking at one another, and we're looking at our boys, and all of them are getting along, all 5 of them. They're playing spike ball and washers, and they're giving each other high fives. They're saying encouraging things to one another. And we looked at one another, and we're like, this is amazing. And we weren't curious about time at all. It's like time stood still. Now, fast forward about 4 minutes later. and they're all fighting, and they're like, that's not fair, you cheated. And we're like, here we go. All of a sudden, we're acutely aware of what time it is. And my point is, at some point in time throughout the day, you're going to think about, and you're going to ask a very important question of what time is it? And guys, that is an important question. It orients you, right? You understand, here's where I'm at throughout the day. That's a fine question. But the question of what time it is, it does have a depressing aspect to it. Because the more that you think about what time is it, it reminds you that your time is running out. In fact, especially if you have a watch that has a second hand, it's like tick tock, tick tock. I mean, you are acutely aware, oh my gosh, every second, every minute, every hour, I'll never get back that our time is running out. In fact, this week I did something that I highly don't recommend, and that's going to deathclock.org. And on deathclock.org, you can put in your information, are you optimistic, are you pessimistic, your BMI, the whole thing. I mean, you put all your stuff in there, right? And so I did it. I did the exercise, and here's what it says about my life, that I'm gonna pass away on Saturday, the 27th of December of 2053, right? So now I know I've got 30 years, that's it. And that's quite depressing. So that's why I said don't do it. So if you feel depressed and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I came to church today to get depressed about this stuff, I want to help with that a little bit and give you one of the most encouraging letters throughout the entire Bible called the letter of Job. Maybe you've heard about that. And if you know or are familiar with the Bible, you know Job is not an encouraging letter. It's very depressing. But Job reiterates his point. Here's what Job says. Look at this. He goes on. He says, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and they come to an end without hope. You won't find that on a social media post or a Christmas card, right? But he's reiterating our time is limited. Then he goes on and he says this, my days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. His point, and what we all know, a reality is, man, asking the question, what time is it? That's an important question. It orients you. But it also is a very specific reminder in your life and my life, regardless if you're a follower of Jesus or not, that we are running out of time. And if your time is limited, then naturally you've got to begin to ask the question, how can I allocate differently, or what can I do with my time? And so what time is it is a good question, but the better question is, how am I spending my time? And that's the question we're going to be dealing with over the next several weeks in this series called Time Well Spent. And my hope over the next several weeks as we talk about some very practical and very helpful things for every one of our lives. Again, if you're a follower of Jesus or not, this will be helpful. That if we're willing to apply the things we're talking about, my hope for you and my hope for my life is that we can all kind of get to the end of our life and look back on how we spent our time, and we can literally say, man, that was time well spent. That's what I desire for every one of us. So that's where we're going over the next several weeks. Now today I just want to lay a foundation for this series. And today I want to talk about one big idea that has one big application that if we're willing to apply it to our life, and I know this is going to sound a little bit like preacher talk, it literally will change your life. And the reason why I say it'll change your life is because if you apply what we talk about today, you're going to change your time. And if you change your time, you're going to change your life, because your time equals your life and your life equals your time. So what is the big idea? What is the big application we're going to talk about today? Well, I want us to hear today from an old wise man. In fact, arguably, he has the best hair of anyone in the entire Bible. His name is Moses, right here. Look at his hair. Is that not amazing? Every time I think of Moses or talk about him, I show this picture because I love this old school, 1950s classic 10 Commandments movie. And that's Moses right there. And he does have really cool hair, but that's not Moses, that's Charlton Heston. Moses, he actually lived 3,500 years ago. And if you know the story of Moses, it's a pretty amazing story. He actually has 3 distinct chapters in his life. Chapter 1 of Moses' life, he was born a Hebrew slave, and through an incredible story, he was adopted into Pharaoh's household through Pharaoh's daughter. The first 40 years, chapter 1 of his life, he lives in Pharaoh's household, which means he lives a life of prosperity. He lives a life of more riches and more just notoriety and more fame than you could possibly imagine. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, everywhere he went, it was like he had gold faucets, he had Rolls Royces, he had the Gulfstream G whatever, and yachts. I mean, not really, but that was kind of like his whole life for the first 40 years. He had all the luxuries you can imagine, all the riches you can imagine. And then, at the end of chapter 1, an incident happens. He sees an Egyptian soldier mistreating a Hebrew slave. He decides to intervene. He kills the Egyptian soldier, and now he flees for his life into the wilderness. And for the next 40 years, this is chapter 2 of Moses' life, he deals with monotony. He deals with boredom. He was a shepherd. For 40 years, every single day, he took care of sheep. Bah, it's like every day. You're like, again, here's the sheep. They wake me up. And every day was the same thing for 40 years. And then chapter 3 begins when he sees a burning bush. And God says, Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to say to Pharaoh, let my people go. And I want you to lead these Hebrew slaves, my people, out of slavery into the promised land. Incredible story. What an adventure of his life. And he goes and he experiences this adventure. He leads the people of Israel, out into the wilderness. And right before they cross the Jordan, 40 years later, right before into the promised land, Moses dies. But right before he died as a very old man, he journals his thoughts, his notes on time, and time well spent. And that's where we get this big idea and this big application. So, what does Moses say about time? Here's what he says. We jump in Psalm 90. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. And what Moses is saying, as I think about my whole life, all the notoriety, all the fame, all the adventure leading the people, all the boredom and mundane activities for 40 years, as I think about all of that, I'm telling you, the only place you're going to find purpose, the only place you're going to find meaning in life is in the dwelling place of God. And the dwelling place means it's a home. That regardless of what you've done, or how long you've done it, or what your story may be, you can always come home because He is the dwelling place that you will find truth, that you will find meaning, and you will find purpose. It's in God. And then he expands upon that. In verse 2, he continues. He says, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, what he does here is so important. If you haven't been paying attention, please lean in. Because what he gives you and me for life is he gives us the context for life. And he says the context for life is this. It's everlasting to everlasting God. And with the stick figure with spiked hair, because I'm into hair, so there he is, in the middle. But that's the context for life. In other words, he says, hey, for your life and my life, for every single one of our lives, again, regardless if you're a Christ follower or not, if you're going to find purpose, it's found in everlasting to everlasting. Objective truth, objective meaning, objective worth is not found outside of that. It's found in the context of everlasting to everlasting, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning, the end. You may go, well, Buck, can you explain that a little bit further? Can you help me understand how that's meaning and purpose and how that gives that to life, being the context? So think of it this way. I would imagine in your home you have a junk drawer, maybe a junk basket, right? And imagine one day you're looking in your junk basket and you pull out a key. And you're like, oh, this is a random key, right? There's millions of keys. There's, what's the purpose of this key? What's the meaning of this key? And without context, you may go, well, this is just another key and throw it away, or give it to your kiddo or do something, melt it down, whatever you would do with a random key. But if I told you, if I said the context of that key is it opens a safe with $1 million of gold in the safe, and that's the only key available, and now you know the context for the key, what happens in your mind? What happens in your heart? What happens with knowledge? All of a sudden you go, this key has such meaning. This key has such purpose. This key has such value. This key's significant. I'm going to protect this key with my life because now I have the context for the key. Moses says the same thing for your life and my life. The context for your life, the context to find meaning, the context for objective truth, the context for purpose, and the fact that you can look in the mirror and say, I have value and worth is found in everlasting to everlasting. And that has huge implications, and you really need to think about it. And it has huge implications for your family. Because outside of God, there is no context. In other words, if the context is this, it's nothing and nothing, that you came from nothing and that you're gonna end up in nothing. And that you're just simply time and randomness and that whole thing. If that's it, then it does have huge implications. And if you're willing, and this is a big deal, if you're willing to be intellectually honest and walk into that room, if you're willing to walk in the room of logic, if you're willing to walk in the room of philosophy, if you're willing to walk in the room of objectivity, then what you will discover in that room, if this is your context for life, is that there is absolutely no objective meaning, objective purpose, objective truth, objective worth, and value. Now, you can feel otherwise, and you can listen to podcasts and read some books and listen to commentary and meet with people who give all these really sophisticated ideas. But you have to sift through that. Because if you're willing to be objective and get to the bottom and intellectually honest, those are all subjective ideas. At the end of the day, what's objectively true, if it's nothing and nothing, and that's the context of life, there is no meaning. There is no truth. There is no value. There is no worth. And that has implications on your life. It also has implications if you have kids. And again, this is what I'm saying. Just be intellectually honest with the fact that if this is a foundation you're laying for your kids, if you're like, hey, it's nothing to nothing, but hey, somehow make the best and make the world a better place. How can you even substantiate that? How can you say that? You need to know you're laying a foundation for your children. That kiddos, there is no worth. There is no value. There is no meaning. There is no significance. That is being honest. And Moses knew this, and he's like, no, that's not true. I've experienced it. I've seen it with my very eyes. And he says, there's such good news. And the good news for your life and my life is that there is context for life. That means you have worth, you have meaning, you have value. And it's objective because of God, everlasting to everlasting. And then Moses goes on, not only gives us the context for life, but then he talks about a reality that all of us will face in life. He says this. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. In other words, he's saying from God's perspective, every single one of us, again, regardless if you're a God follower or not, every single one of us have a time that our life will end, that we all will die. And then he expands upon this. He says, 1,000 years in your sight, that's God's sight, are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning, it springs up new, but by evening, it is dry and withered. In other words, from God's perspective, your life is a blip. It's like a watch in the night. That's a 4-hour time. It's like where grass, comes forth in the morning, but by evening it withers and it dies. Your life is so incredibly quick, finite, and ultimately, we will die. And guys, that's hard for us to process at times, especially the younger you are. I remember when I was in my young teenage years, I couldn't wait for time to go fast. I couldn't wait to be 16. I couldn't wait to be 18. I couldn't wait to be 21, 25. I'm like, woo! Come on, go faster, right? But I'm telling you, that all changed. When I turned 40, something happened. And you may relate with this. I remember it oftentimes would happen when I'd be in bed at night and I'd be about to go to sleep, and all of a sudden this thought would hit me like a lightning bolt. And here's the thought that hit me. You are going to die, Buck. It's going to happen. And I had a second thought that hit me like a lightning bolt. Maybe tonight. It could happen tonight. And all of a sudden I get into this panic mode and my heart would start racing. I'd start thinking about Jill and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these things I haven't done with her. I've made these promises. I haven't been as intentional as I should. Then I think of my 5 boys and where they're at in life and all the things they need to learn and develop. And oh God, there's so many things I could do. And I sit there for like 2 or 3 hours thinking to myself, and my mind races. And perhaps you hear that and you go, Buck, I've had that same moment. I can relate with you. Or perhaps you hear that and you're like, Buck, you have serious issues. I'm going to be praying for you, right? And I would love you to be praying for me. That would be awesome. But the point is this, and Moses' point is, man, your time is limited. My time is limited. And then he goes on and he says something initially that's confusing, but it's so helpful. He says, who can comprehend the power of your anger? Your wrath is as awesome as the fear you deserve. Now, this was originally written in the Hebrew language. And taking a Hebrew language, putting it in a receptor language of English is very difficult. And sometimes it's like, that's difficult to understand. I totally get that. So here's what he's saying. If I had to boil it down, he's saying if we could see God as he is, we would give him the reverence he is due. If you could really see God as he is, that he is infinite, his holiness, that God is the uncaused cause, that God has always been, that God can be in time and out of time. That's by definition who God is. That God is holy, that God is perfect in his love and perfect in his justice. And you could see him, the answer would always be yes. God, I don't care what you say about relationships. I don't care what you say about morality. I don't care what you say about money. I don't care what you say about my wife or my husband. The answer's yes, because I see you for who you are. I mean, you get this. I mean, if you're like, if you're a raving like basketball fan, you would think to yourself, man, if I ever met Michael Jordan or maybe LeBron James, if you're a big golfer, if I met Tiger Woods, if you love Hollywood movies, if I met like, Chris Hemsworth or whoever it may be, I mean, you get that. If you stood in their presence of this hero in your mind, you'd go like, oh my gosh. You probably get a little bit awkward and say some weird things. And, if they ever looked at you and said, like Michael Jordan's like, hey, can I have your shoes? And you're like, sure. I mean, you have a whole line of shoes, but you can have mine too. I don't care, And we would do that because we have this awe and reverence. But that individual, that superhero in your mind, they're a little blip compared to God. God in all of his holiness. God in all of him being infinite. Righteous, perfect. Moses' point. He says, guys, if we could see God as he is, we would use our time as God says. You would think differently about your time in your marriage. You would think differently about how you use your time with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You'd think differently about your time with your son, your daughter, with your friends. You'd think differently about your time with God and prioritizing church. You'd think differently about the time you spend that God has given you the time. You think differently about money. You think differently about everything. And that's his point. That's the big idea. That Moses has given us the big idea that your time is limited and the context for our time is everlasting to everlasting. That's where you find purpose. And then he teaches us the big application. Here's what he says. Teach us to number our days. Why do we need to number our days? Well, he would say because we're not very good at it. We need to number our days because we forget. We need to number our days because we're busy. We need to number our days because we get distracted. Teach us to number our days. Because if you don't number your days, then you'll inadvertently think you have unlimited time. And if you had unlimited time, you're not going to be wise what you do with your time. And you're going to go like, I'll just catch it up next month, next week, next year, whatever it may be. And we're just going to keep putting it off. And what you know about life, especially the older you are. You can only go once around, 20s. You can only be in your 20s once. You can only be in your 30s once. You can be in your 40s like 2 or 3 or 4 times because you're always like 49 or 45, whatever that is. But you get the point. If we're not careful, if we don't number our days, then we live as if we've had this unlimited time, which means we don't limit what we do with our time. And we miss out on what numbering our days gives us. And here's what Moses says. He says, here's what it gives you. Numbering your days gains you a heart of wisdom. Wisdom for what? Wisdom to know what's meaningful and purposeful. And it's going to give you joy and satisfaction, not a blip of dopamine, not a big old rush, not whatever that may be. No, satisfaction, joy, purpose, meaning, objective direction and truth in life. That's the wisdom. So Moses, what are you saying? Well, Moses is essentially saying this. Remembering that our time is limited provides us with the wisdom to know how to spend our limited time. Several years ago, I read this amazing article about a woman named Bronnie Ware. And she's a hospice nurse. And she actually wrote a book, and I would highly recommend it. It's like 12, 13 years old, so it's a little bit dated. But she's a hospice nurse, and she spent her time on the other side of people who didn't have a choice. They had to limit their days because their days were limited. And so she started asking them questions about life and about relationships and about work and about meaning and about purpose. And now that they've numbered their days, what they have is wisdom. And now they're able to say with lots of clarity, okay, I know what's meaningful. I know what's true. I know what I regret. And in her book, she talks about several different regrets. And she says the second biggest regret people had was this. They said, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. This shouldn't be a surprise. Maybe it's a surprise as number 2, not number 1. But I mean, perhaps you've thought this. Perhaps this has flown through your mind throughout the week as you look at him, look at her, look at them, and you're like, wonder if I'm allocating my time appropriately. She goes on to give commentary, and look at what she says. She says, this came from every male patient I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Guys, I've been very honest with you here at Northpoint. One of my greatest regrets in life is the first 10 years of my five sons. During those first 10 years, I worked entirely too much. I exchanged what was so unique to me for what someone else will eventually do, and exchanged so much relational intentionality with my sons. And I've talked about this before. It's one of, if not the greatest regret in my life. And she goes on to say, she continues, she says, women also spoke of this regret. But as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been the breadwinners. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives, and I love this phrase, on the treadmill of a work existence. This book is 12 to 13 years old. I would say if it was done today and the exercise was done today, I think all men and all women would say that very thing. And now we know. You've been given the gift of wisdom. You've been given the gift of fast forwarding and perspective. And now you know, which means that oftentimes we try to chase, if we don't number our days, if we don't think about, man, our time is limited, we try to chase meaning and purpose in this life. We think, hey, if I accomplish this, if I get this title, if I go on this experience, if I have this vacation, whatever it may be, if I have this much money in the bank account, if I just accomplish this, if I just get this much notoriety, I got to go. Somehow there's meaning and purpose in those things. And I'm not against those things. Don't hear me say that. But the longer you live and the more you've got to the pinnacle of whatever you're chasing, you know exactly what Moses said is true. That there's not meaning and purpose in that. That's a chasing after the wind. You will never catch that. And that's where the meaning and purpose is void. So what should we do? Teach us to number our days. She goes on to say the number one regret is I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not to the life others expected of me. And she gave commentary to this to help us understand what she was getting at. And she says, it was the most common regret of all. When people realize that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it is easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honored even half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to the choice they had made or not made. And I love this statement. Health brings a freedom few realize until they no longer have it. There you go. That's a gift that you've been given today, regardless if you're a follower of Jesus or not. That's a gift that comes from numbering your days. And that's, of course, why God, through Moses, who is for you and loves you, would say, teach us to number our days. Because numbering your days gains you a heart of wisdom. Now you see life with clarity. Now you know what's worth pursuing. Now you know what's going to bring you meaning and purpose in life because you've numbered your days. So what does that mean for you and I? What's the practical application of that? Well, here's a thought to have or to think about. Your time is limited, so limit what you do with your time. That's it. It's simple. But if your time is limited, we should limit what we do with our time. We should be extraordinarily intentional with our time. So what can we do? So today as we walk out of here, I want to give you 2 questions. And these are very, very simple questions, but I just want you to actually consider doing this. Oftentimes you hear something that may be inspirational, but then like life gets busy, things get in the way, and you're like, did I do? I want you to do this because if you change your time, you change your life It's in your hands. You have a choice today, tomorrow, every day of your life, and God has given you freedom, and he will not violate that freedom. You can choose, and I want you to choose something that's so beneficial for you, your legacy, your family, and for your purpose and meaning. So if your time is limited, we've got to limit what we do with our time. So what's the question we can ask? Well, with a limited amount of time, a very practical question is, what do you need to do more of with your time? In your life right now, what do you need to do more of with your time? Perhaps it's a relationship. Maybe it's that person who has, that wisdom and insight, and they've numbered their days, but, it just sometimes they say things you don't like to hear. They reflect things you don't like to hear. But the truth is, you need to hear it because they give you so much clarity in life. Maybe it's scheduling a little bit more consistent time with them. Maybe relationally it's with your husband, with your wife. I've said this before, but your wife is a bottomless well of wisdom. That's what God has gifted her with. She has so much insight to what it's like on the other side of you. She has so much insight into your personality. She has so much insight into why you feel depressed or losing hope. She has so much insight into what those decisions and the implications that they will have on your future, on your work, on your legacy, on your children. She has so much wisdom. And maybe it's just spending more time discovering that. Maybe apathy has set in, and I get it. I've been married almost 25 years. I get it. Life is busy. Things happen. But maybe it's just spending more time. Ordering a book on Amazon. Listen to a podcast. There's so many resources to discover how much wisdom and insight that God has uniquely gifted your wife with. Or maybe it's your children. For me, I love being with all 5 of my boys. But there's something so distinct when I'm with one of them. And we go work out together. Or we go, grab a coffee together. And I'm able to ask them honest questions about their life. And I discover their heart at a level and a depth that I don't discover when I'm with all 5. Maybe it's just spending more intentional time. Putting your kids on your calendar. Maybe it's a habit or a hobby you need to spend more time. It's a gift for yourself. Gives you more energy, more life. Maybe it's time with God. Maybe you experienced a little bit of this with Camp 75 and you were part of a bigger story. You said, hey, I'm just going to lean in. I'm going to do something beyond me. It's going to come at a cost. It's not very convenient, but I'm going to do something. And you saw the activity of God, the adventure that he's invited you into. Maybe it's just making church a priority. Maybe it's leveraging time to serve the next generation, to get involved with the next generation, to be part of a bigger story. For you, the question, if your time is limited, where do you need to spend a little bit more time? Or the other question, what do you need to do less of with your time? Again, it could be a relationship. Maybe your wife, maybe your husband has said, hey, that group of girls or that group of ladies night, guy stuff. I'm not saying don't be a friend of theirs. I'm not saying God doesn't love them, but they just may not be best for how you spend your time and being most intentional, most purposeful. Maybe your mom or dad has said, hey, you know him or you know her, you know them. Your friends will determine the direction and quality of your life. Don't try to outsmart that. That's a principle. You either work with it or break your life against it. And maybe your mom or dad's reflecting that. And they're saying, hey, sweetie, would you consider, not that they're a bad person or that God doesn't love them, but they're just not best to spend the majority of your time with. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe you love watching TV or playing golf. Maybe not 5 episodes, maybe just 1 episode. I'm not saying sell your TV. Maybe instead of golf every weekend or every other weekend, maybe it's once a month, once a quarter. But just what do you need to do less with your time? Maybe it's a habit. The habit that there's secrecy and silence around that has robbed way too much of your time and way too much of your relational intimacy. It's time to sit down with a counselor. It's time to sit down with your spouse. It's time to sit down with a pastor and finally bring it to the light because it will free so much of your time. The bottom line is this, guys. You're going to spend your time some way and somehow. Moses, with all this insight, all this perspective, all the adventure of life, says, let me just tell you, your time is limited. So number your days because it gains you a heart of wisdom. And if your time is limited, you need to limit what you do with your time. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for just this moment that we get to hang out and be reminded of words that you've preserved for so long. and words that are so relevant to our lives, every one of us. God, I pray for the courage to do something different. I pray for the wisdom to have eyes to see clearly. And God, may we change our time, which will change our life. And may you lead us to do that. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.